Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. Depending on when and where you listen to this podcast, you may be legally allowed to possess cannabis for your own recreational enjoyment. Or, alternately, it may land you in jail. That's not just a difference between one liberal country's laws and another conservative nation. That's the difference between New Mexico and its neighboring state of Texas. For towns like Farwell that straddle that state line, well, that's complicated. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Michael Sofis of Cannabis Public Policy Consulting about the organization's research into attitudes, applications, and impacts around drug legalization in the US, and just how complicated it can get. Michael, hello.
Thanks for having me.
By way of introduction, could you tell me and all the folks at home a bit about yourself and your research and what led you through academia to the position that you hold now?
Yeah, so I got my PhD in 2018 in behavioral psychology and did a lot of research on behavioral economics, decision making, particularly as it relates to substance use and kind of how people make decisions surrounding substance use. And that led me to a postdoctoral fellowship at Dartmouth College, working essentially for the National Institute on Drug Abuse, researching cannabis specifically and looking at impacts of legalization on various cannabis harms, cannabis use patterns, harms and benefits. And then in turn, that kind of led me to really ask some interesting questions, at least I think they're interesting, in terms of the idea that in what context and how does legalization of cannabis, and specifically, particular policies or aspects of legalization impact public health harms and market outcomes, public health benefits of cannabis use in the real world. So not necessarily from an academic standpoint only, but from a working with state governments. And so my current role at Cannabis Public Policy Consulting, I'm working with, in conjunction with my team, with these actual states who are or have legalized cannabis and helping them sort through and better understand what the impacts of legalization are, what they will be ahead of time, and then how they can sort of use that sort of magic crystal, magic ball, if you will, to better help society at large.
It's serious research and it deserves to be taken seriously. Do you feel like there is the esteem that goes into your research, considering how societally impactful it could be if treated properly?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in academia, it's at least as rigorous as any other type of substance use or any other sort of health or social issue. In some ways, I would, as someone who's biased, who does this research, I would say that it's, in some cases, it requires additional rigor because it's more difficult because cannabis is very complex, both in terms of the legality, both in terms of there's a lot of harms and there's some benefits, and that's not really common, right? If we're studying tobacco, pretty one-sided, right? There's not a lot of benefit, both for individuals, groups, society, countries, health insurance systems, you pick it, it's pretty negative. Well, with cannabis, it's just so different. I do think, that's the opposite of what I've experienced, although I will say it doesn't have I think because of that complexity, it's a little more challenging from like a financial standpoint to find revenue and funding from government and other sources, just because it's not just so clean cut that there's no sort of clear cut agenda. It's not as sexy as, say, if you're studying tobacco, because I can prevent cancer, I can do all these things. And there may be aspects that are similar like that with cannabis, but there's also all these benefits. And so saying, I'm going to give you the right answers about what's going to happen or what does happen with cannabis isn't necessarily a easy sell for a lot of folks, if that makes sense.
Looking at where things are at the moment and where they've come from in the recent past, what's the state of legality in America? You've mentioned the differing legality across the many states, and there's 50 states to choose from. I imagine it's a tough landscape to come up with a holistic view. So if we could start with the top down and work into some details from there.
Yeah, I mean, there's about 2/3 of US states that have some form of legalized medicinal and or adult use cannabis. Although even that sort of how you define the line there for medicinal is really difficult. There's a lot of states in the South, a little bit in the sort of South, kind of the western part of the Midwest that have what's called low THC medicinal use. So extremely, extremely low potency THC that's only that's allowed, or CBD that's allowed for cannabis use. But there's 12 or 13 at this point. We're roughly around there for adult use states. But there's no state is exactly the same. And that's kind of the challenge here. And that's people really struggle with in media, in government, in almost all parts, even in science to some extent, but in particular in these other areas besides science and academia, people struggle with the idea of even a basic what a correlation is and when it can be applied and not. When you start in terms of impacts of something or the relationship between variable X and Y, and then when you throw in 35 different state structures in terms of these policies and how they all interrelate, it's a real issue. That's partly why we created this policy simulation lab, so that we can literally pick apart and look at how every single different change, whether it's one state allows advertising to those under 21 that other states don't, right? And what have you, that if there's a limit on how many licensees or how many cannabis stores, like legal stores, there can be in the state, right? All of these different policies, and we use that to sort of break down one by one, but also sometimes at the same time, how these various policies impact outcomes. And so, yeah, I think the lay of the land right now is sort of things are a little bit all over the place. I think one of the only things that most folks agree on right now is that there needs to be a safe banking act of some kind, which is really just an overall societal benefit. But there's a lot of resignation, I think, that federal legalization is a good ways off, unfortunately, in the US, which I think most folks at various aspects believe, at least on that we associate with believe. And I think the evidence would suggest would be positive. It's a mixed world out there right now in terms of cannabis.
Now we'll get into some of that grey zone in a minute. You mentioned 35 states that had some kind of structure for whatever state of legalization drugs are currently in. When did legalization move from a social campaign to a social reality in those first few states? Was it something that took a long time to kind of come together? Has there been a rapid increase in the last 15, 20 years or so? Has it been fast growing? Has it been kind of more of a slow moving project? What's the inertia behind it?
So states like Maine and California had some very interesting sort of laws, medical laws that are a little bit more nuanced, I think, than the ones we see today, even in like the late 90s and early 2000s. But not until I want to say it was either 12 or 13, Colorado was, I think the first, maybe in the world, like sort of recognized state or country that legalized the broad scale adult use of cannabis. States like Washington, Oregon were pretty close behind. You saw after that, for the next 4 or 5 years, a pretty decent uptick in medical laws. And a lot of states said, well, this is something that I'd like to talk about a little more later, but medical's great. Medical's safe. It's medical, right? Medical sounds great. It sounds like amazing, right? Oh my God, like that's, of course, medical's better. Like I remember I was on a plane once going to a conference to talk about cannabis, and this lady was sitting next to me asking me about it. And she goes, well, I think medical's fine, but not recreational. And it was just very interesting.
I mean, it comes in this very familiar pill bottle. It's got the pharmacy logo on. I recognize this shop. I recognize this brand.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's literally exactly association there. So anyway, yeah, a lot of states did that quickly. Like your sort of New Mexico's, there's several other states very rapidly. And then you started to see what's kind of often referred to as the second wave, which is where like of the adult use, right? So the Michigans, the Massachusetts, of the Maine, these sort of states, and they took Colorado and Washington were, especially Colorado, where had to sort of do this stuff on the fly, right? There was quite literally nothing to refer to. And so there was a little bit of improvement where states like Massachusetts and Maine, had the ability to sort of take some obvious wins and some obvious things that maybe they could avoid from Colorado and such. But it was still was challenging. And so there was a lot of kind of, I think, in general, there's always been sort of a copy and paste approach with a lot of these things because there's just no one really studying in detail how these policies truly impact outcomes. And so then, now we're sort of getting into maybe what could be considered like a third wave, which is, the Arizonas, the New Jerseys, Connecticut's, the New York, that New Mexico for adult use that either have already in the last 6 months or will in the next 6 to 12 months. your Virginias, which is, a good 5 or 6 states that are going to be Vermont. Actually, kind of technically already did, I think. So a lot of that third wave of adult use states, wherein like in a year and a half or so, we'll have about 18-ish states with adult use.
Whilst that's all coming through in terms of approval, I imagine in terms of the penalties within those states, where maybe in neighboring states it has been legalized for personal use or distribution, if that is something that can be quickly addressed, how is that being approached from a law enforcement perspective, considering that this is perhaps a substance that, up until very recently, they were arresting people for, and now someone in the exact same situation with the exact same amount of the exact same substance on them isn't breaking any laws?
That's a really good question. To be honest with you, that is probably one of the biggest gaps in knowledge that currently exists, because it's difficult to measure. States are often in a difficult position in terms of who is actually responsible for that. In other words, there might be a cannabis control commission that is sort of broadly responsible for helping to form the regulations and policies, and to a certain extent enforcing things, but exactly how that's enforced and who carries that out and is challenging. And to be honest, we just really don't know how often it's occurring. I can say from sort of personal experience, like in consulting with states, that there's definitely at least efforts to not, but to back off, to avoid some of the issues as much as possible of the, like things like the war on drugs and things like that. I do think that but it's really to be seen. And I don't have data on that I can really speak to say exactly how well it's going, but it's difficult, right? Because I think states want to enforce it to be fair, but they also don't want to overdo it based on past harms that have been done to particularly underrepresented groups.
No is a perfectly acceptable answer to that question. So thanks for explaining and exploring all the ways that is kind of yet to come through. For the places where it's on the cusp of legalization, you mentioned Vermont and the Virginias, in terms of maybe a grey market there, where ownership is moving either from medical exemption to legalized ownership. Is there any knowledge of that transition market, if that's something that comes up in your research?
Yeah, the gray or diverted markets, there's all sorts of little complexities. Like, it's extremely prevalent for there to be in medical, this is kind of the case in point where if you have a medical state, that a broad scale medical use state, they will, that doesn't have low THC restrictions, you'll see that in our data, we see that a lot of people are using, maybe even really the majority of people who are actually medical patients are using cannabis for recreational reasons. They're self-reporting that. And so it does kind of make you kind of, maybe even like in some cases, like 80 or 90% of people are using recreationally and medically. And then there's a lot of people that there's still a decent prevalence of folks that are using medicinally and they're getting it from like illegal operations, whether it's online, in-person store. There's some caregiver markets that are very it's very gray, and a lot of times it's probably illegal, but it's so close that it's put states in challenging situations. So it's that's increasingly prevalent. But I think that's kind of the point of where adult use can come in, is a solid implementation of adult use. And if it's written well as in statute and things like that, you can really help, I think, curb some of that. And that's important because illicit use is associated with a lot more harms, and there's really not a lot of benefit to society at all for more of that, essentially.
Where do the Cannabis Public Policy Consulting, CPPC, I think is the proper acronym, when do you guys come onto the scene then, and what kind of role are you fulfilling now?
So we work with state governments, local governments, nonprofits, and even some for-profit kind of cannabis ancillary businesses. So not necessarily, we don't work, we're not necessarily for or against legalization. We don't directly work with industry, but so we can stay sort of neutral and unbiased as much as possible. But we really help states provide data-based predictions, simulations about what is and what will happen if they do certain things with their policies, and then kind of have this consulting warm handoff that then helps these states do community outreach and stakeholder outreach and in local communities and ask people what they need and what they want and sort of bring it all together with that database approach. And then we also work in other areas with a couple, for-profit companies trying to create technical solutions for example, things like cannabis impairment, like in driving, things like getting bad, really illicit products that are dangerous off of legal shelves in stores, things like that are sort of what we're really trying to do as well, and work with folks that have for-profit, but that are focused on helping and doing public health related, have public health at least associated missions. And I think that's, I guess in a nutshell, we sort of are a little bit all over the place, but really trying to help solve the cannabis legalization issues in the US, essentially.
To follow up on the database approach that you mentioned there, I've got two aspects that I'd like to follow up in terms of cannabis use. There's the breakdowns of physical characteristic, but also by psychological characteristic. If we could start with maybe some of the hard-coded stuff there in terms of age, location, gender, ethnicity. Who is using what, where, and when?
Well, that's a good question. So in short, everyone's that's 16 and older, and some people younger, everyone's really using, I mean, within reason, at least 1 in 3 folks who are 16 and older in the US, we're finding, at least in legal states, which is now the majority of the US, are using cannabis at least monthly. And this is important because some of the federally funded data sets on substance use, which cannabis is a small part of it, are suggesting things like 13%. And now, to be fair, those are like 2 years old, 2.5. And so like, that's probably a big part of it. But a big part of it too is that there's other reasons about like how these studies are done, et cetera. But long story short, it's 1/3 is, I think, a pretty fair number. And there's other folks that have kind of corroborated that, other academics in different ways. But the long story short is a lot of people are using. Now, young folks do use more. And by young, I mean, your 18 to 25 is probably the highest prevalence and the highest prevalence of cannabis use disorder associated with that. But cannabis use is increasing in period. It's increasing in states that have medical, that have adult use, that have completely illegal. You can't do it. You're not allowed. It's increasing everywhere. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions is, look, more states are legalizing, and look, cannabis use in the US is going up. And it's just like, oh, that's cute. Cause like, I wish it was that easy. But you would be surprised. People like, MDs, other people are like, post stuff like this on social media, other sites, other sources, like with just utter confidence that this is a great argument. And so, yeah, anyway, so it's going up a lot, but it's not necessarily because of legalization. In some cases, I think it's actually potentially in spite of it, at least in terms of the harms.
Well, then on the psychological side, in terms of motivations and drivers, you mentioned the cannabis use disorder, but there's also emotional regulation aspect of things. Is there any consumer breakdown that can be made to say that we know that college students are using drugs to relax and have a good time compared to maybe an older population who are using it to deal with work stress?
So 18 to 25-year-olds make up a crazy portion of it. Like, I think I've done some research suggesting it's like over half of all CUD cases are like between 18 and 29 or something along those lines. It's a very disproportionate amount, which obviously we don't want because of, in terms of like developing brains, they're still developing often in that age range. But the other way to look at it too is that, okay, well, that means in the rest of the population, the prevalence isn't as high. Now, with that being said, just like the prevalence of use measures in federal surveys, the prevalence of cannabis use disorder is dramatically underestimated based on the data we're seeing, like dramatically. I mean, our data suggests, right, that about 100 million people in the US roughly are, maybe 80 to 100 million are using cannabis in the past month. Conservative estimates would suggest 20 to 30% of those people have cannabis use disorder. Our data suggests more, but just to be really conservative. So you're talking whatever 20 million to 30 million people in the US are probably meet criteria for cannabis use disorder right now. In terms of the psychological motivations for it, I think coping motives, I've published at least a paper or two on this. It's very prevalent trying to cope with things, and it makes sense. And it bears out in the data, in the science. There's a lot of other things though, and I think I literally got this finding 2 days ago from our national survey data, which is about 6,000 people across the U.S. And when you use medical cannabis, the number of like reasons or conditions you use it for that are not approved by someone like a physician, right, is really strongly related to cannabis use disorder. But the number of ones that you qualify for, that you've gotten approved for, does not relate to that. And so it's important. And I think, this kind of comes back to what I was intimating before, which is that, medical uses can be dangerous because for the most part, there's very few qualifying conditions that have a really solid corpus of evidence that suggests this really is a benefit. And there are some, there's maybe 3 to 5 where, there's a few others where it's promising in terms of the effects. But most of the time, it's at least as bad, if not worse, like mental health wise, right? I mean, there's probably more evidence now suggesting that if you have PTSD or anxiety or depression, using cannabis will eventually make it worse, not better on average. Doesn't mean there aren't cases where it might help someone. But a lot of states have various mechanisms and qualifying conditions for this. And so honestly, like, the idea is that one of the things I'm trying to sort of push and what we're seeing in our data, and I think some colleagues of mine who do similar research are suggesting similar things, is if we think about cannabis like alcohol in the context of just, you got to be careful with it, but if you just use it recreationally normally, there's obviously medicinal uses for cannabis, which makes it different. But outside of those that are like firmly established, if you need to use, if you think about it like alcohol and just in a recreational context, it might actually be a lot safer from a societal standpoint if people stop thinking about it in it's healthy for everything, so I might as well start treating things, changing prescriptions, so they'll switch out prescriptions. And then also, like, there's a lot of issues with the perceptions of risk. I've done some studies on this associated with any harm of cannabis so I did a harms and benefits. And on average, most Americans think there's more benefits than harm. And so that's not great either. And I think the medical side of it has really been oversold and ironically prevented adult use because, our current president and other high profile governors have come out and said things like, oh, medical's good. Oh, but adult use is like, the worst. But it's like our data is actually suggesting a more like carefully controlled, trying to get systems in place where folks are actually getting their primary care providers and getting access to primary care providers as a part of their medical cannabis use. And then that's really important. And then the adult use side may actually be more helpful in terms of harm. So hopefully that answers your question.
Is there any delineation in your research between cannabis, just kind of medical or adult use cannabis, the raw stuff that people are probably most familiar with, to any of its derivatives, things like CBD, which is in the health shops near where I live?
Yeah, I mean, people, I think, know broadly that CBD is different than THC. CBD obviously has almost no risk of harm. So if at the end of the day, if someone likes it and thinks it's helpful for them, there's not a ton of evidence that it really is, but there's some specific contexts where maybe it can be for certain types of like inflammation potentially. A lot of the times it's not a binary yes or no, it's good for you, right? It could be like it's good for 25 or 30% of the people. It shows it like a small but a nice effect. And then the rest of the people, it doesn't show anything for the same condition, right? And so, there's no harms. So people people do know that, I think, but they also aren't willing to. Usually the attitude is, well, I need this percent THC and I need this, I need indica or what have you to be able to actually treat this X condition. So we've done some studies recently where folks are really passionate that like, I need this, I have to use this method and I have to use this potency and I have to use indica and so on and so forth for my anxiety. But then for my PTSD or my arthritis, right, I have to use this, like, more CBD. And there's just so little evidence that those differential levels have anything to do with it. My guess is that it's because they're reinforced for using, because it feels good when you have THC and those aspects or characteristics of that pattern get reinforced.
I imagine there's an aspect of the comfort in the ritual of it as well. I know some people who are the same with their coffee, that they want to have the exact control over the grind, over water temperature, over how long it steeps, to have ownership of that process and make it theirs.
That's a great analogy, for sure.
Could you tell us a bit about what happens when people are out in the wider world?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and a tough one. It's even more so than I think some other drugs. It depends. There's so many different aspects where you feel like you're just saying the same thing over. Where cannabis is just, it's more complicated than with other drugs in the sense that there's a little bit more tolerance. There's some really conflicting findings, right? About if I use every day, 3 times a day, decent THC level, decent amount of grams, and I'm really just, and I go and I use before I drive, there's some evidence that maybe that's even bizarrely, counterintuitively, you might drive better, right? Now, usually it's not. It's usually just like you might do a little bit worse, but there's studies to show that you don't do as worse as someone who, right, doesn't usually use cannabis, right? So if you have two people, right, or two groups, people that use all the time, people that use rarely, and they use the same amount right before, like a simulation study of a driving simulator study, right, in a lab setting. The people who, there's some studies showing that, okay, they'll both do worse than they do when they're sober, but the folks that use all the time might not do as bad relative to their baseline when they're sober. So it's complicated there. And so it's really challenging. I just got back from a conference trying to determine impairment. What does impairment mean? What does under the influence mean? Impairment in terms of like at the workplace, impairment when driving, and it is honestly kind of a mess, to be quite frank. And there's just not a lot of great solutions for it right now. And so in the US, at least right now, it's just kind of getting wrapped up into other impairment. A lot of states just wrap it up into other substance use impairment. But there's also, unfortunately, a lot of states that have limit like zero tolerance for THC, right? And then what's called per se laws. So like there's a certain amount of THC that they deem to be sort of implicitly like associated with impairment, which is just crazy. And there's plenty of really good studies, multiple of them at Johns Hopkins, with some colleagues of mine that just show pretty convincingly, like you are coin flipping right now as to whether this person is actually impaired. And that's horrible from a legal and ethical and social equity standpoint. And at work, there is been a movement to stop testing for THC. Some big corporations in the US with tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of employees in some cases have moved to away from THC testing because of some of this evidence and tried to move a little bit closer to like actually testing impairment. And there are some cool like cognitive apps that can help with that. But the tough question is always, how accurate do you have to be for it to be fair, right? In other words, if I'm going to lose my job because I use cannabis and what is impaired? Like, is it 10% worse in cognitive performance than normal? Is it 5%? What if I didn't sleep? I mean, if I don't sleep, I'm a disaster, right? So we're still kind of in the weeds, if you will, right now with that stuff.
How long after exposure can THC be picked up at the kind of levels that is going to be, companies are going to be testing for to say that this is indicative of exposure or possibly impairment for people who are going to be judging it in that way?
So that's a fantastic question. Again, tough to answer because it just depends on the issue is. What the definition of impairment is challenging. That's kind of you need that ground truth, right? And so in the alcohol world, even though it's technically not impairment, your blood alcohol level of 0.08, right? Even though it's not impairment, it's been associated enough in research for people to say that's impairment. Cannabis does not have that yet. And that's the challenge. I honestly, in terms of what it would mean for impairment and the individual differences, right? That sensitivity, that tolerance, even like things like fat cells. I mean, cannabinoids are stored in like fat cells. There's all sorts of weird genetic individual differences that is going to change that time profile. But I mean, broadly, right? Like, and it also depends on the method, right? Or is this the potency? What else you're doing at the time? So you can vary really widely, to be honest with you. Obviously, a lot of times you're going to see it the first 15, 30 minutes. If it's a lot, high potency or in a lot of amount. And then it could be anywhere from an hour to 2 hours to 3 hours, all the way up to 5 or 6 hours with edibles, take a little more longer to get through. So there's a lot of variability there, which again makes it really hard to create policy to create regulations that are really going to be broadly beneficial.
Are there any professions or fields that you see things being the most tightly clamped down on, or on the other hand, the most permissive for casual use of cannabis within?
It's a good question. I mean, I would assume, I don't know, but I would assume work from home would be a pretty good example of remote work, that being particularly if someone lives in a legal cannabis state. So I think that's probably a fair assumption. I will say that obviously transportation, I think what folks have in the HR world refer to as safety sensitive positions. Again, the definition, the line there, the operationalization there is challenging, right? Obviously, someone who's driving a train or flying a plane is clearly in that sort of role. But what about the forklift operator? Okay, well, maybe the forklift operator is, but what about someone driving a golf cart or like what? And then you come back to what is impaired. And really, I think there's been an issue with, I think people are also thinking, at least from the HR world too, what does this mean for these people? Like they're concerned about really some of the same issues as the war on drugs, about further marginalizing people. And when someone, if someone drives on the influence, for example, and I think the odds of them having cannabis use disorder are way higher than if they do not, right? And so they're strongly linked. And I've done this across multiple studies, different time points, different states. I mean, just the whole 9 yards. And so oftentimes they need help or they need treatment or they need just assistance of some kind. So it becomes really challenging. Like even from a workforce perspective, it can make a good business case that helping these individuals is the better way to go than trying to do punitive programs.
By comparison to the restrictions that have been brought in against, say, binge drinking or curfews that have been placed on bars or pubs to try and limit the amount of the social harm that comes out of a substance in the environment that it's in its context, in its community. What kind of situation is cannabis use in that kind of regard?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. I think it's a progressive thought. And I think it's, at this point, though, I think based on where states are, it's kind of a luxury to be able to start approaching that. In other words, trying to, I know one of the things that I think would be great, and there's some states that have done this with more like just driving under the influence in general, but like rideshare programs is a good example. Like these sort of harm reduction strategies, where states and I think actually more like localities, I think Washington, D.C. has this, where it's like they'll help fund, particularly on holidays and certain like high drinking days, subsidize like an Uber or a Lyft or another type of rideshare company to provide, like in a lot of cases, even some cases like free rides back home from the bars or what have you. And so there's a lot of stuff, a lot of confusion and debate about what to be done about like cannabis lounges for the reasons that you're bringing up, right? I think the issue is there's really not a lot of infrastructure in place to support that in terms of things like incentivizing rideshare programs, other harm reduction strategies. So just the entire idea of like how cannabis is used in public is so far from even coming close to being sort of standardized or decided on a consistent at states and localities across the US. So it's almost like what you're bringing up is a great point, but it's almost a few steps ahead of where I think folks are even able to really to consider right now.
And to bring things back to the personal safety and managing one's well-being with specific attention to mental health, you mentioned the dependency disorders, but also the link that there is between post-traumatic stress disorders, either as something that people use to soothe their symptoms of the condition or something that could trigger the onset of symptoms. And equally, on a purely biological level, the presence of anything that is not air in your lungs is going to have some metabolic biological activity to change the function of your lungs. I mean, I guess ultimately, if people are going to be using cannabis, what is the most safe way to facilitate that? And are people likely to do that sensible and safe thing?
These are some really good questions. To speak to the physical stuff, there's one of the challenges with like, okay, does cannabis cause this health condition, right? Is you need to do longitudinal studies, right? So these are usually at least kind of like 10-year studies, oftentimes ideally 20 or 30. And so with cannabis only very recently coming to the forefront, right, we're just starting to get some of those first legitimate studies in when it comes to things like lung health, things like heart health, cancer. The ones I've seen do suggest like it's going to increase the risk of those. Now, exactly how much compared to tobacco, right, or combustible cigarettes, how much based on whether they use X, Y, and Z other substance, right, is still very much in flux right now. But I will say that there's unfortunately, what's good individuals are, increasingly think cannabis is beneficial, despite the fact that there's a lot of evidence suggesting it can be harmful, and maybe more so, particularly as it relates to mental and biological, physical outcomes. The funny part is that's the one side that makes me sound a little bit like grumpy old man. But then there's the other side, which is, I think, makes me sound like the opposite, but which is also data-based, which is the folks I have just looked also this week, so kind of fresh off the plate, in 20 different states, right? We have this big sample, 6,000 people, and just from last April, so like 3 months ago, not even. And adult use, and we shared this in another state in our previous project in Maine, actually, and then we shared this in these 20 states, where the more that you use adult use in grams is not related to any sort of additional risk for cannabis use disorder and driving under the influence, which are arguably the two most sort of problematic outcomes for adults, arguably, as it relates to cannabis. But like when it comes to like, if you get illicitly, it is significantly related. And same thing with medical. And so like, it's at least, so what we're seeing is it's at least less risky per unit of gram to use adult use is what the implication might be. So we still have to do follow-up. We're going to do another survey in the next month to get follow-up data on that, do another round. But like we're seeing and then we're seeing within states, we have a study right now using California data that generally speaking, when you start mixing, so the safest folks that are using in terms of severity of use, right? So more or less problematic use are the folks that are just using recreationally in California. Then it's medical is like in the middle if you just use medical, and then the worst is if you use medical and rec. And so generally speaking, so you're seeing even within subjects, so within that same person within the legal state, and then looking at the state as a whole across states, you're seeing this same pattern. So again, we're not for sure yet, but we're really starting to see some stuff suggesting that adult use might be the way to go. It might be, if you just normalize this as a part of every, like, yeah, I drank a beer, I had some cannabis, whatever, like ate an edible, whatever it is, I ate a gummy. If you just normalize that as opposed to maybe overemphasizing the medical, I think we could see at a population level a big reduction in harm. But the issue is that people are not conceptualizing like that. And when I say people, I mean the average US citizen. And unfortunately, a lot of politicians are thinking of it that way, including some of the highest folks in the US.
Going back to the top-down view, thinking of the political and economic stability of widespread drug use, if someone is impaired beyond the ability to attend work and contribute financially, possibly on a long-term basis, then if that is matched with an upward trend of usage generally, then is that something that on a policy level people should be wary of?
So to put it in perspective, the amount that the relative rates of increase, I think, are actually pretty subtle. They're not like robust. It's not like we're just seeing like tripling every couple of years or something, right? It's not anything crazy. I think a big part of it is people probably didn't report that they were using it a lot of times in the past. And I think a big chunk of it's that, right? There was legitimate consequences, and in many states there still are. So it is, legitimate consequences to if you were to report, if they knew your identity and that you use cannabis, right? So I think that's a big part of it. So I don't think it's as much, but I think the idea is that if you use every once in a while, and just because you're using the past month doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, right? It takes, and that's kind of my point is what we're seeing with the adult use is I like in my ideal world, I honestly, like you always want to have medical use so that you can help filter folks in with like a primary care provider and as a part of their larger health plan and their larger health goals. And you want to be able to make it, maybe reduce the price or keep it tax-free or things like that. And I get that. But if I had my druthers, I would want to go straight to adult use and have medical be like a subcomponent of that, but really emphasizing the adult use side, because I do think a lot of the harms are coming from, at least some of the harms are coming from sort of these misconceptions and often driven from a medical overly focused medical side of things.
To try and summarize all of everything that we've just talked about, do you have any kind of final thoughts, any roundup or cohesive message that you think someone who's listening to this should take away, maybe if they're in a position to be making decisions on a policy level if they're involved in local or even national government. With everything that people will have learned over the last 30 or so minutes, what should they know and what can they do with that information? And more importantly, where can they find you to find out more about your work?
First, encourage them to go to our website, cannabispublicpolicyconsulting.com, because we have a lot of free reports. So some of the stats I brought up today I have free reports brought up there. We're going to be doing a series of 3 or 4 of them in the next 6 months on things like social equity, prescribing medical cannabis, from actual people who are prescribers, or recommenders, I should say, actual social equity applicants and other licensees, people who were not able to get a license. We're going to have a whole public health report, a workforce report. So there's a lot of free resources, and we're going to have some data simulations we're showing people to try to get people to understand what's really going on. And I would, definitely encourage anyone who is involved in this in any way that's, that they deem is important to contact us, because I think, unfortunately, we're the only organization, to my knowledge, that actually works with states actively with data and simulations to actually try to inform policy, which is unfortunate, to be honest. And so we work with companies. We're really trying to sort of bring everyone together to try to help solve this problem. So help really maximize societal benefits of cannabis. So that's what I would probably urge folks to contact us at cannabispublicpolicyconsulting.com.